Thanks. So just to recap really quickly, just so if anyone is not here and they just see the recording, we're presenting what we're working on here in Rio, this project called the Common Space of Organizations. The original idea was just to be a regular in-person meeting to present and disseminate STP's work and to welcome political organizations to speak about different political processes they're involved in. The idea started with having 3 different meetings, and then Fernanda also joined, helping to run the communication, inviting people, making people know what we're up to, the contact with organizations, and so on. So we have like a theoretical seminar 1 week, then a militant inquiry the next one, then an open debate we call a collective elaboration the next week, and Fernanda runs communications. So it's something like this, what we'll get. The seminar is meant to, or at least was meant to, furnish the discussion with new categories that we then use when we're listening to the inquiries and listening to different organizations. These organizations, their experience also furnishes us with examples, things that we can use when we're just making these debates and having these debates with people. And then they also raise questions, which we then can use in the seminar for further development. And there is a special thing, which we're going to talk about also, which is the idea is that not only inquiries lead to elaboration, meaning you listen to a political group and then we meet again to talk about it, but one inquiry leads to another because we try to connect the political movements that we invite, right? I'm not sure if I forgot something up to this point that we should also mention. No? So, yeah. So the idea, I think that this is the most important thing, right? The method for this changed as we started because we originally intended that we would be presenting STP's work step by step, almost as if we were gonna go over our texts and construct the argument point by point, and then like a seminar, right? But what actually happened is at a theoretical seminar, usually we start from the people's debates and people's ideas and experiences, especially problems that they raise, and we try to bring out of that discussion the motivation to present some part of STP's theory, not necessarily in like a step-by-step thing. So the seminar itself started having a slightly different method than the one we planned. And the role of the inquiries as well also became even more central in motivating the conversations, right? So, for example, we're going to discuss this later on, but we've been discussing for the last 3 weeks in CSO what is a militant inquiry and what's the political use of it. And that wasn't something we were planning. It's just something that once we've done a couple of these interviews or investigations, people who are joining the group and participating started asking these questions. So we decided to pick that idea up and follow through. And the very way we're presenting STP has been kind of conditioned on the questions raised by people who are joining, right? The other thing is that we're still developing, I mean, this is connected to that particular question, but we're still developing what is the theory and specifically what are the protocols for the militant inquiry. As you saw here in this slide, the idea is that one inquiry connects with the other. And also an inquiry is something specific. An inquiry is not an interview, and it's not a conversation, and it's not just a political presentation, right? So if you just invite some militants from a group, or what we normally do, we invite one representative from a political organization. Well, usually it's the person that is used to speaking in public, so they will kind of say exactly what you want to hear, or they will say exactly what's the group's propaganda or something like that, right? So you get to know a bit about the group, but something you could probably find out some other way. So we don't want to just give them a platform to speak like their propaganda piece. We don't want to have an open conversation where we're just sharing opinions. We want to get to know a bit about the organizations themselves, beyond what militants represent for themselves about what they do. So these are some of the ideas we've been developing on how to, on the method and format for the inquiry, so that it can be this other thing, right? So the first thing is that we invite one organization per inquiry. We never invite just one person. So if one person is going to come to speak about their group, we prefer that another person comes together, so that you always get more than one perspective or approach. And I guess that you could say that by looking what is invariant between the two, or looking at what none of them can speak properly about, you get a feeling for what is the organization that is a bit better than if you had to trust directly what people have to say, right? We also avoid leaderships or public figures. So we try to invite militants who are not just a public figure, or not leaders who are used to speaking in public. So people who will have to think while they're there talking to us, and have to work through their ideas, not necessarily come with something prepackaged. And then the thing that connects an inquiry to the other are these two last conditions. That if you come to participate in one inquiry, we ask that you send a member of your organization to help lead the inquiry of another organization. So we asked you questions in the first one, and in the second time you come and you help us ask questions to a new organization, right? And fifth, like the idea is that we don't do just one inquiry with an organization. So if they come early in the year, we're going to invite them again late in the year to talk about their organization a bit more. So we have a chance to again to compare, right? More information, and try again to see things about these groups that is not just what they have to say that they already believe to be true, right? I think another thing that we should add here, I forgot, is that we don't record these meetings. We don't share it. So it's a closed space. People who come to speak here, they're speaking only to the people who are present at the time. They're not like promoting their organizations online, right? We even try to, we've been discussing this idea of like perhaps giving 5 minutes to groups to speak their mind in this kind of propaganda style early on. We record it. We can help them promote it online, but then that's over and we can start. So it's clearly not what we're doing, right? I'm not sure if I forgot something, but I think that these are kind of the main ideas behind the militant inquiry for now. But it's all very intuitive, I think. Like we have an idea of this orientation, right? Of not wanting to simply get the representation that militants make of their politics, but actually get something else out of that investigation. And all of these are attempts to do that, right? Attempts to shape a bit that representation. And I think often the strategy in this method is to substitute one person, substitute one thing for two things. So one inquiry becoming two inquiries, one representative becoming two representatives, you know? The person who is in the position of being interviewed also being in the position of the person who does the interview afterwards. So everything to kind of shake a bit this kind of situation of I'm asking questions, the person is giving answers, and that's just it, right? I'm not sure if it's clear, like what the method is here.
I think that there's something I just wanted to add, as it's something you already said, but I think it's worth repeating. I think the idea to have the groups returning and returning twice, I think this is very much in view with the fact that first, we don't think it would be something that is good if like we have like just an extraction policy, you know, like we get a group, we extract some information, and then from this information we build a theory or whatever, you know. I think that there's the idea that having these returns and returns in different positions, as Gabriel said, I think it's an experimental method of trying to establish a certain relationship with another organization, you know. There is this further goal that I think that we haven't had the chance yet, but it's something we're experimenting, which is when one organizer participates in the inquiry of a third organization, considering that we are CSO is one organization also, there will be some potential links that might even extend beyond CSO. So I think it's important also to make it clear here that this is not simply inquiry in the sense of information extraction, you know.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I think this is missing here, and it's something that we discussed last meeting. I think it was the first time we discussed it. But we're still trying to work through. I think Vitor was the one who developed this the best last time, because there isn't, like, when you see the history of workers' inquiry, it's often the idea that either one of two things. You're doing the inquiry, the investigation, so that workers can see themselves better. Like, it's a mediation, almost with no content, just so workers can have more class conscious, be more politically organized, and so on. Or you have the idea that you're extracting information. For example, Marx is extracting information from workers in his workers' inquiry to find out about special sites for political intervention. So you pass along a questionnaire and you find out that there are a lot of work accidents in a certain factory. It might be a good factory to organize at because people are disgruntled and so on. And what we're trying to do, and I think that in the meeting we wanted to have only about workers, about militant inquiry. Later on, we'll have a chance to discuss a bit better, but it's the idea that, again, goes back to this slide here, which is not very clear. But that the inquiry is also inquiring about the things that make different organizations look more common, right? So I think there are multiple goals here. We could say we want the process to facilitate one organization seeing other organizations qua organization, right? So rather than distrusting comrades or distrusting a different group because they don't share your ideological point of view, you can still be different. You can still do your thing while they do their thing, but you can see yourself as part of an organizational ecology. So there is a kind of a educational aspect to learning to see different organizations under that light, and also facilitating minimal connections because they will share each other's spaces, right? If you're doing an inquiry and then the next time you're in someone else's inquiry asking questions, that also creates a minimal possibility of connection. So you try to educate or at least share the idea that such a point of view is possible. And you also try to promote minimally the conditions for that type of connection to happen, right? So I think that what Rafael makes, it's very, very much central here, right? Connections here are not just like a simple term. The idea is to actually be able to measure the success of the inquiries based on the connections we're able to produce, right? They can be of different sorts and so on. But I think that would give this this title of concrete meaning, right? The inquiry should be able to point to what is common, and STP's wager is that the point of view of organization today is the best point of view to find what is common in the sense of common problems, common solutions, common enemies, and so on, but also build a space in the sense that you actually need to connect the little bits and pieces that you find, right? So I think I just separated here two.
Oh, can I just add another,
Sure.
just one? And this connection, it also involves ourselves because connecting with other organizations there's also a measure of trust, you know. So we are already in the process of also seeing when we connect with certain organizations, what sort of movement we have to do ourselves, and by that, the people in CSO who are organizing, so that they can see that it makes sense to interact with us, you know, and that takes a measure of organization also on our part, because uh, this involves, you know, seeing how we can interact, what we can do, how do we get involved, and this also, I think, in a sense, it really makes clear the fact that the connection is like the main wager we are betting on.
Yeah, I think you could even give that example, right? It hasn't happened yet, but the next group we want to invite, which is the people who run a popular kitchen for the homeless movement, homeless workers movement in Brazil. They are offering a trade, which is they come to our inquiry if we do volunteer work in their kitchen. So it just goes to show that, like, it's when we write this here, right? Inquiry connects with inquiry. Every inquiry is actually a point of contact of two organizations. In this case, CSO and whoever is coming to the meeting, right? And here is also a connection between, okay, two different organizations which don't include us, but we are also here in the other inquiry. So it's very clear that you can't really do this thing if you don't treat yourself as an organization, because you need to give people something. You need to, it's not only a matter of trust in the sense of, you know, they are suspicious, but also in
Yeah.
the sense that perhaps you won't be able to see the relevant things if you don't go there, depending on what they're doing. Like some things that they can talk about because you will see if you go, you know. So for example, we're very likely gonna invite people from Teia dos Povos, the Webs of the Peoples, which is a land movement that has a lot of settlements throughout Brazil, but they have one in Rio. We're probably going to have to go to their settlement before the inquiry anyway. So it requires that constant exchange, you know. And I guess it's not the time to do this. We haven't really discussed this, but I do think that a really good principle to look at this is to, you know, to make a parallel with money. We discussed this briefly in the last meeting, and we already discussed this in S2P in terms that political organization in scale, in large scale, it does have to solve the problem that money solves, right? To get resources across, to coordinate action, to evaluate the cost of things. And I think that in a very, very, very small scale, this little process where different organizations are measured by an inquiry and then might acquire a relation between them, and that this involves a certain type of exchange, which is not monetary, but it's also not communitarian or just a normative one, which is a political exchange. I think it shows that this, you know, this idea has a connection with, ultimately, I would say, allowing organization, like if commodities see each other as commodities through money, we could say that organizations are meant to see each other as organizations through the inquiry, right? So that's a very, very ambitious way of describing where this could be aiming at, right? So I just wrote here two principles that we already kind of are learning about the practice of doing this. But I think that we're just very, very early on about this. And we really want to have a separate meeting where we go in depth about the theory of what militant inquiries are. We can use the examples of the inquiries you already done to discuss it. So, but just to give a very simple kind of set of principles, I think the first principle is this idea that the politics, what is political about an organization might not be what it represents itself as being political. So sometimes groups might present themselves as saying, well, our political work is that we talk about Marx to people. But then when you see what they actually do, like that part has no effect. Whereas, organizing lunch and dinner for people who wouldn't have access to that space otherwise is actually the thing that is the most effective. Like, so it's not often, doesn't necessarily have exactly. It's exactly the problem of constructing a political censor. Yeah. So, but then that's the whole point. Like, if you need to construct a censor, a way to sense where politics is happening, that's because politics is not self-evident, right? The way we represent what we're doing when we say, I'm distributing these pamphlets for the revolution. Well, it might be the case that everyone is throwing away your pamphlets and they don't contribute to the revolution, whereas something else in what you're doing actually does. So there is a minimal divide or kind of structure behind representation, which we're trying to aim at. And secondly, I think that one thing that we are also learning, and it's part of what we're developing as a theory, is that militant inquiries are a general dimension of politics, right? I think we could say it's pretty much the way we have to, or it's a theory of the different ways we have to learn about, like to bridge over the difference between the set of all the things we can do together and the set of the people involved, right? The fact that we can do much more through the connections that we have when we organize than simply as individuals. So one way to sort that out is by creating ideological descriptions of what we're actually doing as a group. But the militant inquiry is trying to find out what that bigger set of connections is actually capable of, which sometimes is not what it says it is, right? So that is a kind of general dimension of political processes in general, right? It just takes the form, or we think it needs to take the form of an inquiry in this kind of interview-like process because of the type of group we are, which is a small group, which is not in action together with other organizations. So because we're a group disseminating and developing theory, so on, then in that space, the militant inquiry might take the form that it's taking, but it should be theorized as something broader, right? I think as Victor said here, right? You could think of it more generally as a method for locating and maybe creating it when the place doesn't exist, where our theory and approach to politics places us in relation to the ecology of the left or revolutionary organization. So we haven't had that many meetings. We have like 9 meetings thus far. Is that correct? No, actually more, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 meetings. Tomorrow we have the 13th. And I mean, I think we thought it would be nice to go over each meeting just to give you guys an idea of how it's going. But what do you guys think? Should we still do that? Sure, right? Yeah, so the first meeting was in mid-November. We just tried to justify, the first 2 weeks of November, we spent trying to find a place to do it. And we found this really good printing house. It's like a 3-story building that has a printing house in the first store, the ground floor, and on the 3rd floor, and the second, or sorry, the ground floor and the 2nd floor, and the 1st floor is empty, and they rent it out usually for free to political groups to hold meetings. So it's a really great space, and we started doing the meetings there. The first meeting, we just spoke a bit about the history of STP, the idea of the common space of organizations, just to give people kind of a sense of what it is. I think there were about 10, 15 people that day. Not much more than that, right? And it was pretty hot because there were still no air conditioning in the place, and it was like ridiculously warm. And then we had the second one the next week, and it was the first theoretical seminar where we tried to introduce the idea of what is a point of view of organizations, in which sense it is distinct from how we regularly discuss politics and discuss political groups. I think that idea of point of view of organizations, it's actually the thing that drove the discussion, the theoretical discussion, the most until now. And so we held a seminar on that, and then, which I don't remember much about. I think it was actually it was the first seminar, and it was already the day that things didn't go as planned, because I think Rafael didn't go that day, but I think Vitor and myself were there. And while we were waiting to start the meeting, a couple of people we know who had gone started talking about problems in occupying problems in occupations, in urban occupations, and how they usually don't work, or how they're limited. And we just picked up from that discussion on the limits of autonomist Marxism in Brazil, the way that settlements like either they gain a victory and then they dispel, or if they lose, you need to start everything all over again, and how some militants that we knew had preferred to move to more institutional politics. I think we were having that discussion, and from that we went into the discussion of why do we mean, when we talk about organization, why do we ultimately mean that you got more structured into an institutional thing, like a party or a public institution? So why make that connection? And I think that motivated the conversation, and we started discussing why the concept of organization should be rethought based on these problems. Then the next week, the third meeting we had, was the first militant inquiry we did. It was a kind of special one, because not only was it the first, but Vitor was presenting together with someone else on their own political history. So they presented on the history of the political process of the Invisibles, which is a movement. Vitor can speak more about it, but it's a movement that they were part of that helped to organize. How do you call terceirizados? I think we already asked this once. I don't remember.
Outsourced.
Yeah, outsourced workers, right, in public universities. Don't know if you want to say something, Victor, about how it went.
Yeah, I think there was like looking back on the meetings we had. I think there was like a constructive moment. It was like there was like we didn't plan it, but we ended up like building a basis for the next meetings in the previous meeting. In a way, like the first seminar, we were talking about how like a reductive view of political organization ended up leaving us not having tools to process the political processes that happened, like whenever it worked out or it had actual consequences. And when we did the inquiry with about Invisibles, I think a large part of the insights I at least managed to have was understanding. It's like if I applied the organizational point of view to this specific political process, I can draw lessons that are not like I shouldn't do. I shouldn't like have acted in this way or in that way. It's like we can draw lessons that are applicable to future processes.
Yeah, I remember one thing that I mean, just to go really quickly over the practice, because I think that it goes to show how this influenced the discussions in CSO. We focused a lot on the fact that the Invisibles produced a newspaper inside amongst the outsourced workers where they could write down their accusations of problems that were happening at work, right? These are people who work at sanitation, security, administration in these universities, and they could anonymously write their accusations, right? That their how do you call this, denuncia? Yeah, anyway, they could write down these accusations about the management, about teachers, about the people who work there. So we talked a lot about the type of mediation that this journal was producing, right? What type of action it allowed for, what's the limits of those actions compared, for example, with producing like juridical processes to go against the university, things like this. What's the limits for action? And we had Vitor was speaking, then Zé, another person, was also there. And we had a third person who was in another state in Brazil joining us online. So the three of them gave like their different expositions about the history of the movement and so on. And then the next week we had a collective elaboration meeting on that experience, but also connecting with other processes. I would say that like the first meeting had about 15 people. The second one had like 5 people, 6 people. The third one, the inquiry, I think around the table there were like between 8 and 9 people, perhaps. Then the collective elaboration one had like 5, something like this. Does that sound correct?
Del, Ju, Pedro, besides us, right?
Yeah, it was like with the 4 of us plus them like 7 or
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh,
And
I don't
again,
think I don't think Fernando was in Rio at that time.
True.
So it was 6, but yeah.
And I think that there was something, I mean, we returned to this idea many times afterwards because it was, I think, a good example of that idea that politics can be something that militants are not necessarily representing for themselves, because it was very remarkable in this meeting that, we spoke about, we were assessing how the inquiry went, discussing about political victories and political defeats. And then we spoke about a very famous defeat in the autonomist left in Brazil, which was the courier strikes and the way that they were co-opted by the delivery company iFood here in Brazil, because iFood changed something, created a forum for couriers to debate their political needs inside iFood. And while we were debating this idea of cooptation, this idea that they had adapted to include, something that would like take advantage of the fact that organizing courier workers, delivery workers is so hard because it's very expensive in terms of their time. It's very hard to get everyone together and so on. Somebody in the meeting, one of the people who were just participating, said that for him, it sounded like a victory. Like the group of militants who were working together with the courier workers had managed to bend and change like a multi-million-dollar company. And I felt like that was, I'm not sure if everyone agrees, but I felt like that was an intervention very much in the form of what we were looking for. Because somehow the way the discussion had gone, the way that we were approaching the problem of cooptation, the problem of organization and so on, it allowed, right? And that's why I mentioned that in the first theoretical seminar, we discussed this problem of cooptation and bureaucratization. A couple of meetings later, it seemed to come back in the form of, well, but this could be seen as a partial victory, if something was built on top of it. And I remember that has some effect, and we still use that example in the other meetings we've been having. So I think that was an interesting way that the cycle at that moment kind of completed for the first seminar, the first inquiry, and the first collective elaboration.
Yeah. Can I just add something?
Sure.
And I think like this is something that I really want to stress because it's something that happens a lot in our meetings, which is we are discussing things and then there's a flash and then there's a mutual understanding. Like clearly we step into some concrete novelty, you know, some issue that everyone in the meeting feels that it's relevant, you know. And I think this is an important thing because we to emphasize for two reasons. First, because I mean this discussion on regards to this company and the how what resulted of the political process. I think like through the discussion mediated by a previous discussion accumulated in the cycle, I think we were able to get some notion of that experience in view in a way that we were able to look at it in another way, you know. And I think this is like, I don't think I'm exaggerating here, but I think like there really was a, you know, a blue screen on Vitor's face, for example. There was like this surprise, and it seemed to make a lot of sense because we were able to treat the situation in a way that it seemed like there was more to do. And to echo something that we've been discussing in our inquiry meetings, which we'll bring up, which is Mao's discussion on militant inquiries and the idea that to conduct an inquiry is to solve a problem, you know. I think in a sense that really happened there because it's like a new view of the process opened up where other types of actions could be done, you know, not strictly related to this political process that we were describing, but related to other issues. You know, I know Vitor can talk more, but I don't know, just something that I wanted to say. I'm going to read now Vitor's comments. Okay.
While Victor gets some tea, yeah, so Rafael already presented a detailed meeting. I think, was it an open meeting? I think it's on our website, I'm not sure. The meeting on how, I don't think it is. I think we kept it as an internal meeting, right?
Wait, what?
The one on how the national meeting of STP in Brazil went.
I think that's closed probably, right?
Yeah. So, but after this first cycle, we had 2 days of meetings with everyone we could gather from Brazil's STP members. If anyone who is here didn't get a chance to get the news of how that went, it was a big success. We can send the link for the unlisted meeting where we explain how it went. It was really interesting. I think it's worth adding it here because it was by far, I think it surpassed expectations in terms of how many people we could get. Like we didn't plan it as a like very public event, but we still got the place very crowded with a lot of people. And after that event, a couple of people who went to the event started coming to the CSO meetings. So that's why I added it there, right? So in January, we started a second cycle of theoretical seminars. We again discussed the point of view of organization, and now we used a division, which I think is really useful as a way to introduce the idea, which is a distinction between organization as a type and the organization as a point of view, right? The organization as a type, it means to define organizations as a type of thing that exists in contrast to things which are not organizations. So you can choose what it is that you want to call an organization, but that means there's a particular format, which is an organization, and other types of political activity are not, right? And usually we identify some traits for what organizations are. Usually when we call them a type, we mean there's a particular form that things should have to be organized. So it doesn't necessarily is the party, but it might be like groups where people have specific functions, right? Groups that are closed, so you either belong to them or you don't. Things like this. Usually an intentional activity, meaning it's impossible for people to be organized despite themselves. Like usually being organized is a conscious action. I will get organized, right? And it's also something that where is intentional. It has a particular form. All right, there was a third thing, I forgot what it is that we usually. It's usually more ordered than the rest of your life, right? So becoming organized is also increasing in order and ordering. So more order and intentional, and it has particular forms. Versus the idea of point of view organization, where you're not looking for these three characteristics. You're assuming that everything, both your social life as well as your political life, is always organized, but organized in different ways. So a spontaneous protest is organized in some sense, but it's not intentional, right? You can't really compare it necessarily in terms of being more ordered, because there can be very complex ways of ordering things that from outside look like disorder. But for example, protests can also be analyzed organizationally in terms of how people behave, where do they take their cues from to know how to act, and so on and so forth. So we use that distinction between organization as a type and the point of view to further develop our approach. And I think that it was really useful. A lot of interesting questions were raised afterwards about this. And I think that it clarified this basic idea that once you adopt the organizational point of view, you might assume things are organized, that even the people who are acting it out don't think are organized, right? So you're not necessarily looking for people's intentions. So it clarifies that thing we mentioned above about the inquiry looking for politics in places that sometimes militants themselves might not see it, because you want to see the organizational effects of politics, not necessarily what people want their politics to be, right? So I think that also helped us a bit give more kind of theoretical background to the idea of the inquiry. And then we had the second one. The second inquiry was the end of January. It was a very interesting one because first of all, it was the second inquiry, so it was the first time to really kind of try it out without including one of us in the inquiry itself, right? This was a group. It's of left-leaning or more radical-leaning Marxists inside a center-left party. PDT is kind of a physiological, mid-sized party, not nearly as big as the Workers' Party in Brazil, but they do have a strong institutional presence. They win like some mayor's office. They had governors. They have senators. You know, their candidates to presidency sometimes are mildly popular. They have a history of populism and like workers' politics. So they are a revolutionary collective inside of that party, trying to push it further to the left, and with a very interesting history. So I think the Invisibles inquiry. Perhaps correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but I think it was a bit exceptional because since Vitor was part of the Invisibles, he was one of the militants organizing it. It already made the conversation more organically lean in the direction of questions and problems that we were trying to raise. Whereas with this group, it was the first time that it was only through our questions and our interactions with them that we could try to raise these issues. And furthermore, they are part of a party, and that means that they speak publicly all the time. And it was very funny that we would ask a question, they would be like answering it in detail, concretely, and then the guy would get up and start like just spilling propaganda, like, because you know the revolution is to come in this and that way. And one of them would actually pick up a phone and start recording it. Like, you could clearly see that the address of what they were saying at that point wasn't the concrete people in front of them, you know? And I think we raised a lot of interesting questions after that meeting about what are proper questions? How do we investigate concretely with whatever group comes to visit us? Like, how do we actually work around this kind of, I think if you want to be analytic about it, it's kind of resistance, right? To thinking through what you're doing, because you can just shift the gear and go into this propaganda mode where you're just speaking to an abstract public and you're not really thinking about your own process, right? So I think it was a really, really good inquiry because of that. It raised a lot of interesting questions. We came up with nice ideas that we haven't really had a chance to try out yet. But for example, the idea to ask a question, and if you see that they resist giving you an answer that involves thinking, like if they just give you like the pamphlet, someone else in the group can ask the same question with a different wording, you know, because now you broke a kind of line of resistance. You can try again, see if they give you a different answer. So using repetition in a certain sense to see if something else can appear, things like that, right? Yeah, Jamil is asking about the if we've done that sort of thing here in STP, right? And I think that in some sense, I think the Communist Caucus is the one that we have the greatest chance of doing that properly, because you can see that we did the same thing, right? Dennis and Fatima went there to present and talk to them about our work. They are now coming to present to us their work, and we're thinking about taking that relationship with their organization further. They want to involve us in the tenant movement in the United States. Like, I think that's an example. Like what we try to do with the Vienna students, we could probably analyze it from this perspective as well. So I think that question would be a great one to follow up on in the next meeting as well, because we could line up a bunch of cases of us talking to organizations, right? Yeah, exactly. The Vienna students. I think that that was kind of a prototype of how to do it. We always received more than one of them. They spoke about a lot of things. We used their example in CSO as well. I think that they provided a really, really nice example of the difference between world and environment, because we were talking about how, even though they had grand ideas about politics and about what they wanted to do, like they spoke of climate justice, they spoke about a bunch of things, you could see in practice that the world that really interacted with them was small things like, is it cold outside? Can we stay in the occupation? Do we need to leave? Things like this, right? And just to answer, I mean, I really want to bring this up when we get to it, but clearly Badiou took, I mean, it's explicit. Badiou took the idea of investigation as part of the generic procedure, right? In being an event. Like when you're reading the chapter generic procedure, he introduces the concept of investigation. It's definitely Mao Zedong's concept of militant inquiry. He says that as much, that an investigation is a militant inquiry. So it's there already. It's just totally underdeveloped and lacking the meat, perhaps, of how to operationalize it. But you can definitely, if you want like some technical stuff that we could use, if anyone is up for that, that would be a great way of preparing for the meeting on militant inquiry, or perhaps develop that's perfect, or even to develop a second meeting. You know, we could definitely connect the theory of militant inquiries to both the theory of points and the theory of investigations, which are pretty much the problem of locally finding out what connects, right, with a truth procedure. So it's definitely connected, those two things. So the meeting after the Popular Revolutionary Action, it was again a collective elaboration meeting that Rafael ran. I think it went very well, but it was also the meeting where the question of what is a militant inquiry then was raised. And that has been what we're focusing on since then, right? I think there were many other questions that were interesting too. We tried to provide like we introduced the idea of the modes to discuss the difference between party organization in PDT and other political groups in Brazil. Well, I think there were many interesting discussions that day, but I think that particular question that one of the participants raised, like, okay, but what are we expecting to get out of this practice of inquiries? Like, what is it for us, like an anthropological thing, ethnographical thing? Is it something that the movements themselves can use, right? Actually, if now I remember correctly, we had just finished creating like a huge diagram, you know, with like individuals, mediations, worlds, and then there is like the political movement, and PDT and the Popular Revolutionary Action Group sits here with the modes, and then the guy just said like what how does this get back to them, you know? And we gave some reason, yeah, because of this and that, but then we spent the last 3 meetings trying to respond, I guess, with this seminars and discussions on militant inquiry and so on. Oh, JB, that would be amazing. I mean, I think that it would be really incredible if we could like have a day of discussion, especially on the concept of investigation from, I think it's Meditation 31, right? I don't remember now which one it is, the one that kind of conceptually introduces forcing and the chain of conditions and so on. Like, I think that's the most obscure part for people of that construction. It would be really useful. So after that questioning, this is what we've been up to, right? You can see that the last meeting here in this description is the one that's happening tomorrow. Mid-February, we gave a long history of the workers' inquiry as a kind of backdrop to what we're doing. We discussed Marx, Lenin, Mao Zedong. We discussed the Americans with the Forrester, the correspondence kind of trend, right? The CLR James group. We discussed the socialism and Ebarbert group in France. We discussed Italian workerism. We discussed the post-Maoist French groups, and we discussed the Brazilian history of doing like inquiries connected to Catholic groups and like liberation theology and also education with Paulo Freire, who was a Maoist pretty much. And so that we did like this big history. And then last week, we had our first kind of introduction debate on the specifics of militant inquiry. And it was a very interesting meeting because we were ready to have like a meeting pretty much proposing that we were updating Mao Zedong for the 21st century. But there was somebody in the meeting, a new person joining, who clearly like hated this type of radical political stuff, and who was like against authoritarianism, you know, against totalitarianism, that kind of approach. So we had to navigate like constructing these ideas, but also not alienating them. So it turned out to be a very challenging meeting, but I think it was a good one. And now we're preparing tomorrow to pretty much try our first syntheses of what is militant inquiries about, so that we can move on, right? And have our third militant inquiry the week after, like, so next week. So next week, so Yeah, this is a good idea we had that we want to use more as well. Could you, I'm not sure if it's your mic is bad, Victor, if you want to talk about it, perhaps.
Yeah, I think we were discussing like when someone raised that point, like how does it get back? How do the militant inquiries get back to the organizations? And for us to be, for us too, what's the point? Um, um, so we were thinking maybe uh, there is an aspect of like exercising a like a point of view, a, a a type of analysis that would permit people to view their own organizations and other organizations in a different manner. So it would be like I think the objective of the one of the things we could offer was help militants uh, become more close, have a assume an organizational point of view. And we believe that may help militants coordinate efforts inside their own organizations. And if that process is shared between more than one organization, so that's where the idea of like one organization sending someone to the next inquiry, we think we can like educate ourselves and educate the militants who join us in how to compose a political ecology, what are the problems that will happen during that, how to handle them, how to develop that kind of practice. Uh, so I think that sort of justified why it wasn't just us like thinking about ideas, but there was a educational process of like qualifying militants to be able to become organizers and become able to relate to other political organizations.
Mhm. It's interesting because now that I see the way that you propose the distinction, you can make, like, usually people call organizer a type of militant, right? The organizer in a militant group, he or she also doesn't need to know about the whole organization because, for example, organizers sometimes are people who are gonna uh, put together, you know, an assembly. Like, it's true that that's more collective than just, let's say, doing a task, which is what we usually associate with militants. Like, a militant is doing a particular task, like I'm writing down something to publish, or I'm taking this from this place to hand in to those guys there, uh, or I'm gonna join this protest, right? It's a very local view. But you can have something which is still not the organizer in our sense if you are, let's say, well, my task is to put the assembly together. That's not necessarily looking at your organization as a whole, right? So seeing your you might not see the whole ecology, but seeing your organization as a whole might also be something slightly different than what we usually think organizers, at least in English, when you talk about organizers, what they do, which is like militants concerned with gathering people, right? So organizers in this sense of taking the organizational point of view on my organization, being able to see some of its contradictions stemming from economic problems, realizing how much exactly. I think organizers can be thought of thinking not so much about producing an effect, but also reproducing the organization, right? Uh, yeah, I think it's a good, really good distinction. And then the problem of communists is not only reproducing a organization, but moving forward the ecology as a whole, right? And stitching it together and so on. So the next inquiries we have, we're doing once a month, right? That's kind of what we do in a schedule. So in March, so in 2 weeks, not this week, the next one, we're receiving 2 or 3 militants from the Workers' Party, which is the current government, right? And they're going to present on the international experience and the international actions that the Workers' Party accomplishes. So the Workers' Party is the main coordinator of something called the Foro de São Paulo, kind of something like the São Paulo Forum, that holds together a bunch of international parties, many groups, and so on. And they work with that forum. So they're going to talk to us about what that experience is, and so on. Then in April, we're going to receive welcome militants from the Popular Kitchen of the Homeless Workers Movement. This is the movement that, as we said, we need more time because we need to go to the kitchen, work in the kitchen as well. Then we can get to invite them to join us. And the idea is, again, that somebody from the Workers' Party will stay to participate in the inquiry of the Popular Kitchen. So it's a more autonomous movement who works, outside of government. And we're going to have part of the questions, part of the debate coming from people from the Workers' Party. And then we're going to invite them to stay for the May event, when we're going to invite a couple of militants who run a communitarian, I'm not sure how you call this in English, but it's like a prep school for students who want to go through the main exam to go into college in Brazil. They do like this type of communitarian prep schools in the peripheries of Rio. So we're going to welcome them to talk about that experience. Then in June, we're going to do the same with the Web of Peoples, which is the Teia dos Povos. It's a movement that we spoke a bit about it here. Hopefully, before that we invite them, Michael and I can try to have the meeting we wanted to do here on STP, presenting a bit of the Web of the People's work. It actually might be good for us at CSO as well, so we can kind of get more acquainted with what they do. They are a very interesting movement here in Brazil. It's a land movement of national character. And then in July, we're planning to receive the Popular Community Movement, which is a hardcore Maoist Christian movement that creates autonomous communities in favelas in Brazil. So that's the first 5 ones, the next 5 ones that we have planned. And the idea is to try, again, to have it back and forth with them, to go to the different places, work with them as the best we can, invite them to join us. There are other movements we're discussing also that we might welcome for the second semester, but for now, these are the ones that we have planned. And this is also useful, and I think it's also relevant for us. Since we started CSO in Rio, there was already this opportunity in the air, because I work at this Alameda Institute. My work at Alameda is to connect researchers to political organizations. So the Institute funds some researcher, and my job is to make sure that their research on political matters actually connects with something that is actually happening on the ground. So what we managed to do is to get Alameda to fund CSO in Rio. So they're giving us money to pay for the space, so we can actually start paying the printing place for renting us out the space. We're paying travel costs for guests, transportation, even flight tickets we can pay for some people. We can pay like a small amount for the members of CSO who are working on with all that we're doing there. And all that we need to offer in exchange is to add a further day that doesn't get in the way of our regular activities for welcoming members of Alameda's network to present on their research. So scholars, and from time to time, if we identify amongst the organizations that we welcome, militants who might want to do research and who kind of line up with Alameda's research agenda, we make the connection between Alameda and those people. And then Alameda might fund them so that they can leave their work for 6 months or so and focus on writing something about their political activities, right? So we're scouting researchers for Alameda. In exchange, we're getting some funding, right? And when I managed to get Alameda to agree to this, they also agreed to help us recreate CSO in other places. So the next one that I need to create one in is London, because that's where Alameda has a headquarters. But since we're currently doing a project in Lebanon, they are also interested in creating one in Beirut. They're also interested in creating one in South Africa, and they are also interested in creating one in the US. So imagine like in a 2-3 year span, if CSO works, if we manage to make it sustainable, for Alameda, it's not that much money to sponsor this. They might sponsor STP's activities on the ground in all these different places. And I'm currently coordinating this process, right? So just to conclude, currently the Common Space of Organization is running in parallel with STP, right? It's just a small project. We never present ourselves as speaking for STP in general. We always say, well, the theory we're talking about comes from STP, but we're not like presenting as if it's the Rio de Janeiro cell of STP. But CSO could not only serve as a pilot project that other people in STP could adapt and reproduce elsewhere, right? But it's also something that it gives a more concrete or practical sense of what STP could be. Like if you wanted to see what we could look like if we had in-person meetings, if we focused our activity without giving, not leaving the theoretical space, but connecting it even further with different political movements and so on, I think you could get a sense of how that could look, right? By looking at CSO. It is different in the sense that, as I think it became clear from the different meetings and the story that we told, that it's kind of led by the interaction with political groups through the militant inquiries. That's clearly the center, you know, and the seminars and collective elaborations are working through a lot of stuff that appears in these very rich encounters with other groups. Unlike STP, where it's clear that the theoretical meetings are the core, and inviting groups, having other groups to join, that's actually something additional. If it doesn't happen, the group doesn't dissolve or lose its purpose, right? So how these things could be more integrated, if they should be more integrated, if we could reproduce this elsewhere, if there is interest or not, these are all open questions. But it does look like, in a certain sense, STP is more a place where organizations appear in terms of the interior, right? I think we're a group where we experiment more with our own internal structure, right? And for example, with the book project now, you can clearly see that the more we focus on making sure we reproduce our own organization in our project. So let's do the book in a way that even people who don't know the theory can participate in writing the book. Let's do the book in a way that even if it doesn't get published, it's still useful for us. That shows that, you know, the interior of our organization is the core concern. The maintenance and exploration of that interior seems to be the core of STP, whereas with CSO, it is much more kind of focused on the exterior, right? It is kind of an encounter between organizations where they meet outside of themselves first, and then you try to create some commonality, right? But they don't know each other. It starts from the place of, we don't know who are the people we are organizing with, which is different from STP. I'm not sure if this is as good a description as I thought it was, but it's definitely different. So it's not meant to substitute, right? But it is, I think, a useful starting point to think if there could be different ways these things could be integrated. And it's not written here, but I think it's worth saying that's also why we thought that this meeting was good to have at this point. That you can see that CSO has a very concrete use for the STP book we want to write, right? Like being able to share that book, to refer the conversations back to the book, gives a concrete sense because it helps to expand the boundary of STP, right, through CSO, because at that boundary, we will contact other organizations, we get a chance to find common places, to share theory and so on. So the book has a practical and strategic role in CSO, which is even clearer, I think, than STP, perhaps. So I think it's good to, not only because of the name discussion we were having, are we going to change STP's name or not, but also in the sense of the whole trope of thinking the book as a means rather than an end in itself. I think it's very clear what that could, what does it mean to think of the book in that way, for the common space of organizations, because you can see that it has a certain path to walk, you know, and that theory plays a different role. We need something compressed that is easy to share. Like it can give a clearer sense. And even to the point that the publication of the book could be a good kind of marker of slowly focusing more on this type of work, or at least opening the door for us to use the existence of the book, the fact that everyone in the collective becomes a representative of S2P through the book, right? You can just say, I wrote this book. It should become much easier to create things like CSO in some version or another in different places that we are, right? So it seemed like a good idea to present about the project now, because it can play an interesting role, if you want, in the larger strategy of S2P in the next couple of years, I think. So yeah, this is just the website. You can find it here. It's in Portuguese, and this is the Instagram page where we publish the stuff we're doing. I think the Instagram page has a nice little detail that perhaps is worth sharing. I'm not sure if you can see it already. Ah, yeah, you can. We're doing this at the page. So if you see how it is on Instagram, these are the posts for the meetings, right? And if you look at them, they construct like a big drawing. They connect with each other as if it's like a big shape, you know, of a bunch of little things that have some relation to each other. So as the more we have meetings, the clearer this big picture will be, you know. So I think that's cute. I'm not sure, Victor or Rafael, if you guys want to add something, but those are the slides we had prepared. I'll share them with you guys now.
Yeah, I think that one of the real learning experiences is at the same time how much the concepts help us understand what's going on. I think it's very interesting because we are not taking this as going through S2P's texts, even though the book might have a very useful function. It probably won't be as like it probably won't be a study group in the sense of a reading group, you know. I was even thinking like this is something that we should have in mind, but because I do think that this practice is really making a lot of the concepts make sense, and since they are not presented systematically, I think this is helping a lot in treating this not as a theoretical corpus that you have to dominate, you know. I think this is something that, at least from the experience, we circle back a lot on where we go. And there's the added benefit that when we circle back, a lot of the problems, a lot of the missing points of what we're talking about really shine through. So I think this is something that's really noteworthy to add, you know. And also I think like what Gabriel said, it's a very simple type of practice. And there is some issues that I think we talked about, like, for example, we do have, it is easier due to the fact that we have like 4 people in the same city, you know. That's not something we can discount too easily, you know. I think the power of cooperation really shows itself in this aspect. I think like one thing that would be very interesting to look into the future would also be like, what is the minimal like set of instructions that could be useful for, like, if one person wants to set up a circle, you know, if one person wants to set up a common space of organization, like how should they, you know, they go through it. I think that there are some issues there that like it would be interesting to talk and discuss also with you guys, you know. I don't know, just some random rambling before we discuss this more openly.
I think there's something that's important to discuss also. It's that I think there are like two bets that CSO makes in relation to STP. That is like if we make a physical space and raise a bit the cost of participating, we can like attract a certain type of person that I that's what I personally believe. I don't think we discussed this, but like organizers and communists are more likely to come to something that has established like cost of coming that like signifies commitment. So we know you're going to a meeting that people are going every week, and it will make sense to a specific type of person to come. And there's another point that's like there's a bet that if we manage to do this space for like 6 months, 9 months, like some time, something will happen. I'm not sure what exactly, but it's like, but there's going to be a qualitative change over time because it lasted more than this type of thing usually lasts. And I was thinking maybe for people who are like alone in their cities, I think the national meeting of STP in Brazil was very helpful to get people to come the first time. It was like a launch of the book project. So I think it was like a good tool to get people to come to the first meeting, and maybe that could be like one of the tools to try to begin an organization in a place. Like if we have the book or something, we can make like something of a public event, and that could be the first step to at least get one or two people to be interested and organize with you. That's it.
Yeah, just to add to what Vitor said, I totally agree. I think that it's interesting because STP doesn't have an online presence on like social networks, right? But one thing that we found out, I think, is that once you start getting a bit of organic interest through publications and things like this, you do get a lot of people who come through that kind of proximity between online political discourse and the fact that we meet online. That creates an overlap, right? That's an overlap that has interest because, of course, we want more people to join. We want people to find out about what STP does, but it's an overlap based on potentially based on a misunderstanding, right? Because online political discourse has very low cost. Like everyone, of course, which is good. Everyone should have their opinion, should talk about whatever they want. But when they come to STP, sometimes they get kind of a scare at the level of stuff we're doing, how much you need to learn about, or sometimes it's inhibiting, and we need to do work to make people feel welcome. All the things we want to do and we're ready to do, but there is usually an initial kind of shock because it's an overlap of proximity in terms of internet discourse and online meetings, but it's a very big disjunction in terms of type of commitment, right? Because of course people can come and go. STP is very open about that, but people end up feeling like if they don't engage and so on, they might feel alienated. They might feel like they expected something and got something else. Whereas the regular in-person meeting, I think the surprise tends to be positive rather than negative, in the sense that the commitment is a bit higher. You need to get out of your house to go. but you get there and we always have a cake and some drinks. You get to meet people and then have a beer afterwards, and the cost is a bit higher to arrive, but I think people get positively surprised that it continues, right? That it's an enduring thing, and you might not come 1 week, but next week it's still there, and so on. Whereas here, the continuity is not necessarily cherished, because it can be confused with the facility of political debate online, which is costless in terms of exactly, JB. Like, I can tell you, like, we're becoming really good sommeliers of different cakes, and I think we're at the verge of creating our own theory of cakes, the composition of cakes, depending on the debates that we're gonna have. So yeah, like, you get to see more concrete. I think it spreads out in a concrete form that there is a real concern with social reproduction inside STP, whereas even though that thing exists in STP in general, everyone is concerned. We've been going over this a lot of detail recently. The online structure, it flattens these things. You don't get to see them. So your first impression is not that you're joining a group that is worried about integrating people, making people feel welcome, because your first impression is getting that conflict of, low internet risk with a high intensity group, whereas there is something slightly different and slightly more recognizable, perhaps, in the in-person structure. I think, I'm not sure, but I think it's really, really, really useful thing. And I think that it's different also. For example, we can get a better information from seeing how many people come, like, to CSO. Like, it's a very meaningful information to know how many people are per meeting. It's not like based on theme or whoever is presenting. It's definitely connected to the organization. Yeah, and it's way harder to bullshit and just like yeah, I guess.
Yeah, I was just before Renzo, because I think it's like very, very hard to look straight up at people's faces and not do the walk that's gonna connect them to whatever you're saying, I think, like, for whatever reasons, people feel more inclined to interrupt, to ask questions. This is something that we've been seeing with more or less varying degrees, and you get I think you do get a bit more. There's a bit of a, you feel more compelled to over explain yourself and to repeat yourself. But I also think that there's this dynamic, because the meetings are really structured very differently from STP, right? So I think, as Gabriel said, it seems like there is no internet pizzazz in our meetings. Like, it's negative pizzazz. There's cake, there's a bit of water, there are lame jokes, of course, like we have here, but yeah, they last 3 hours. I think this is important. Yeah, I'll just let Renzo talk.
No, I had some. I mean, is the time to make questions and comments?
Yeah, I was gonna ask, do we do like a 5-minute break, or do we plow through? I'm curious as to why we should prefer cake, because, oh, pizzazz. I read pizza and I was offended. Sorry.
Pizza
Sorry.
over pizzazz. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. My fault. No. Yeah, I mean, I think that's like pizza and cake is like, it's like the conciliation between transition and revolution. But we're
I mean,
revolution.
you guys might have opened a new door for CSO. I mean, why don't we have pizza instead of
Oh,
cake?
fuck. Yeah, okay. I'm going to to keep thinking about that.
Okay, so let's gather afterwards to discuss yet tomorrow's menu. Renzo, yeah, but you already raised your hand. I think we could talk a bit and then we can stop afterwards.
Yeah, can I share my screen because I was drawing while you guys were talking. Um, yeah, so I mean it's two questions I think and two comments, like something like that. But no, the first one is a comment on the names, like on the discussion of the names, because initially I was like, maybe like STPs is more like broader theoretical space which can accommodate for more differences because it's theory, it's easier to like, we're not deciding anything, we're just like thinking about stuff, so it's easier to have like a common theoretical space and then have a more like practical engaged thing like CSO. So in this sort of model, CSO is like a part of STP, but then you can also like think it backwards and say, actually, like STP is just like the theoretical, more like project of this common space of organization. So it's just one organization among other organizations, and then theory is more like purely theoretical thing, is like just a part. Then in this case, STP is more like a part of CSO. And then like in the end, I was like, maybe you can also look in a way that actually both STP and CSO are doing the same thing, because what's changing is actually the scale. Like STP are like, we do theoretical stuff, but we're engaged with like organizations a bit like CSO. So we did the Vienna, the Communist Caucus. So I think it also makes sense to say where STP does something similar to CSO, but on the international sort of like scale, where we have to deal with having to meet online and this sort of limitations. And in this case, we're actually are the same kind of organization doing the same kind of work, just at different sort of scales. I mean, this is just, yeah, trying to make sense of how the names, in the concrete discussion about the names, what exactly is the relationship between STP and CSO. Then I was wanting to ask like two questions to hear more from you. Like one, I think you distinguished at some point like the difference between CSO being the sort of like the mediation between two organizations. So by proposing this sort of like condition whereby like one organization have to come to the next one, you end up like forcing them to sort of like this, or not forcing, but like offering a space for them composing. So CSO appears as this sort of common space, as the name suggests, versus the actual, like when CSO appears as the sort of like organization trying to connect with another organization, and then the mediation actually is like the stuff you get to exchange. So yeah, it's just a general question of, you think these are like two aspects of the inquiry? And yeah, like I also thought about like how in this case is that CSO indeed appears a bit as this sort of like border space of connecting to sort of like interiors, or like trying to like reach out, right? And then yeah, I also wanted to hear if you have thoughts on whether this common thing, whether there's there's a meaningful distinction between common as like a union between two things, like this envelope, or a common between like the intersection, like having a common part, like in this case, you find something that is included by both organizations. In the second case, like these two things are actually part of a bigger thing without necessarily intersecting somewhere. Yeah, just a question. Like, I don't know how to distinguish these two things organizationally. It's not clear to me. So it's just like a curiosity. And yeah, and then the rest is like just trying to think connections with the things we have been discussing on Thursday, me, Victor, and Rafa, on like the reproduction of organizations. And yeah, I just wanted to like just this diagram we were trying to also like interpret. So I just use as example the things that you said, like we get examples from then, but we have to like exchange some work. I wonder if this kind of like illustrating from the political mediation theory we have is a way, like the way that we find a mediation that gives us a perspective over the organization and vice versa. And these are all political mediation, so they all commute, versus the more like reproductive diagram in which you just like look at different arrows, but from the point of view of reproducing the organizations, right? So say like the kitchens get to reproduce themselves once they can get some work out of CSO, and CSO gets to reproduce itself when it can extract some sort of examples from it. I mean, we were trying to make everything compatible like this. This is just to show that from the diagrams we have, we can extract this both point of views. And yeah, this is just like, yeah, a remark on the things we were discussing of how there seems to also be this two types of work that appears, like maintaining the space is more like organizational work of connecting and reproducing something we already had, versus trying to like act on something. Yeah, I try to be like synthetic because I have to leave very soon, but yeah, yeah.
It's amazing that you actually managed to put all of this together during the presentation. Yeah, I just wanted to, I mean, just to I'm not sure if anyone wants to intervene, but just on what you said first. First, no, the first thing was on the name, but I think that there's a good discussion to be had there. But on the second slide, the compositional, and then the third slide, right? We haven't discussed this. My idea was to introduce this tomorrow, as kind of my own shtick on these things. But I really think that, I mean, you guys are already doing this on your Thursday meeting, which is something I think we're doing with all the modes, mode A, B, and C. We haven't discussed this yet, but it's something that is happening, which is when, like, we just wrote a long paper on the mode A, and it became clear while writing it that there's something about Marx's value form that is more general than value, which is the idea of the simple value form, the expanded value form, right? Which is the genesis of money, is the genesis of a universal equivalent, right? We saw that if you change the logic, the same steps apply to the genesis of kinship as a structure, as a sort of universal theory of how kinship relates. It's not just applying Marx, because it has nothing to do with value, but the idea of a transcendental logic that gets, regionalized, then you need atoms, then you can produce objects that see the world, right? That idea is something that we saw that applies to mode A, B, and C. And I think what you guys been doing on Thursday, from what I've seen thus far, is that you're also doing something similar with politics, because we're managing to apply ideas of reproduction cost, even organic composition, to discuss something like relative surplus cooperation, right? Things like that. It's again splitting capital into two and finding that there is a level of Marx discussion, which is something like the pure dialectics of form, which is not a capitalist dialectics. Depending on the logic that is underlying the dialectical process, you get mode A, B, and C. And if you focus it not on the logic, just coherence, but on political action, you get something else, which is neither mode A, B, or C. You get resources to discuss political organization, right? So I think we can do the same thing with what you called here compositional inquiry, because my impression is that you can talk about the encounter between two organizations, what we're calling an investigation. It's the simple form of political encounter, right? It just means one organization connects with another. Now, what is the value of that connection? What is the semantics for that connection? We don't know. It's totally arbitrary, right? But you can take a certain position from which you can start creating series of connections. So a certain organizational process is the same as a bunch of organizations connecting to each other. That's the expanded form of value applied to politics, right? And then you can invert the order like Marx does with the money form, where a bunch of connections is expressed in one organizational arrangement, right? I think that the theory of militant inquiry is like the simple form of value. It's like an encounter where the question of what is common is posed. The theory could unfold and the practice could unfold to the point that you get to the political equivalent of the money form, which is usually socialist planning. And what is socialist planning doing if not assuming that we know what is common amongst all organizations in a space, and therefore how to connect them all at the level of their very reproduction, right? So if we take the theory of militant inquiry far enough, and I mean, this is something we discussed in our history of workers' inquiry. You have a model of this, which is Mao Zedong's theory of investigation. It became the basis for the Cultural Revolution. Like the way that he defines what an inquiry is, the encounter between militants and organizations, and the way that intellectuals are there to learn from the thinking of the people, and the way that it's based on meetings, not based on writings or anything like this. If you extrapolate that, you get to a certain theory of how to generally relate organizations amongst each other through a certain form. It's perhaps a failure, right? But it is a proof that there is a continuity from militant inquiry to social coordination problems. Like it is the same theory, right? So that's first to say that I think the two things you added here in the compositional diagrams, CSO as common space and is building connections, we could probably order it at the level of moving from simple arbitrary connections, right, to all these different debates. I don't know how to go about it. Then the second point you raised, the slide below this one, on the conjunction envelope or basis, right? I think that you don't want that to be decided, right? I think what you want is to find out case by case, because each one of the things of the arrows you added in the middle, they represent pretty much like in a very basic form, the three logics, right? So if given an organization here and an organization here, and we don't know what the relation is, and we say, well, the connection is that each one occupies their own space. There is no overlap. That might be a connection at the level of B. They form a proper open-closed duo, right? I start where you end. For example, we could say this is a very mode B structure where you could see somebody from the Workers' Party saying the autonomist movement is meant to work precisely where we cannot. And you guys are able to feed, revolt in a place where we can't reach, like something like this. This would be like, a government relation to the autonomist from the standpoint of mode B. You can see like something that looks for the common envelope of two organizations, more on the level of mode C, perhaps. When you say, well, if we cooperate, we can produce something that is bigger than the parts of the movements. So we can integrate at the level of some concrete process and construct something that creates something more than we could by ourselves. For example, you can get like a general strike. That's a concrete process that unites different organizations into a bigger whole, right? Or you can get the recognition that there is a common form, like a common form of life below the difference between organizations. And that's more of a mode A connection. So not knowing this and having to stitch this together, these connections, case by case, this would be, let's say, the generic investigation defined in a multi-logical kind of way, right? And we're keeping it to the idea of org1 equals, in a very weird sense, we don't know what it is, org2. So it's like the simple form of, so I think that the question you're raising here is actually it's a perfect question, but it shouldn't be theoretically answered on its own, you know? Because, for example, this would be perfect. Like, imagine organization 1 has a relation with organization 2 based on mode C. For example, we're going to do a joint protest where going together to the protest is the best we can do to make the protest more powerful, right? So that's like this. org1 equals org2 at the level of some C activity, right? But then these guys have nothing to do with org3, which, like, if they go to the protest, they're going to fuck it up completely. So here you need a pact of mode B where you say, you stay in your lane, we stay in our lane. That's our agreement. That's how we connect, right? And then you have all of this here sharing with some organization 4 a mode A structure where there's no action in common, but there is that common kind of ritual of updating that there is, you know, an underlying commonality between these different things. So like this list of connections here, the meaning of the equal sign is being stitched across modes, right? So this is totally impossible to happen for any social logic. This is this is politics, right?
I think we need a meeting on this.
Yes, I think, yeah, but does that make any sense? Like I just thought of it, but I really think it goes somewhere. Like I think
No, yeah, I said that because I think it makes sense, but that's the
problem.
yeah, no, because I think this is something that I think this is something yeah. Sorry.
No, sure.
No, but yeah, but I do think it makes a lot of sense. I don't know what if Renzo wants to.
Yeah, no, on the first point you said, I think it makes a lot of sense, this generalization of Marx logic. And I think we stumbled a bit in the discussions, like I remember on 2 instances. Like one is this, I think this move that goes from I'm not sure actually, but there seems to be this more like sacrificial logic of reproduction of organizations that seems to go in like autonomous struggles that have a certain scale and at a certain stage in which like expanding is at stake, versus we talked like how at a certain point there's this conversion to like having to reduce costs of reproduction and trying to like think about structures to like bind stuff internally in a way that sacrifice doesn't like destroy the whole process. But I think this has to do like more generally to like how there seems like, yeah, I think it's in the direction of, and the second thing I remember is also like how that, I think at some point we discussed that the text memes with force, like it proposes the meme as this sort of like basic thing, but I think the limit of proposing the memes or like the tactic, which is like this, is an like a gesture from autonomous sort of like thinking, but it proposes this sort of like simple encounter that you were saying, something like this between the simple encounter and the general encounter, like you propose like a singular gesture that cannot be sort of like co-opted into this to general thing. So I think it has this flavor of like how you, from something simple and singular, you actually compose general types of organization that can actually like have this sort of up until this universal kind of organization in which you can incorporate all those types. So like I think the move from, for example, encountering the encounter, the political encounter versus creating a network of contacts. So say CSO has ties, right? To like it creates, it starts from the single encounter, then it starts to have a list of people we have ties with. So it creates a network. But there's probably like a third step in which you guys get to know all of them, but then you have to create a space in which there's a minimal compatibility between all these organizations, you know, right? Because probably at some point you reach a level that fine, we have ties with all these things, but if we actually try to like propose a common sort of action, it will be impossible because they are actually very contradictory. It's just the fact that you have interacted with them individually that was possible, but how you handle like, you know, like the composition between all, how you make everything consistent, it's related to the problem of money, right? How you go from the general, like being able to individually like exchange with organizations, like a list, you can exchange with all organizations. That doesn't mean that the space is consistent as a common space. So I think I totally agree that there is something towards this generalization, which
but-
we yeah.
No, I think you're correct. But you know, now that you said this, I think it clarifies. Can I again? Sorry, can I share my screen as well? I think we could do something like this, which I think clarifies something that was always in your remarks about memes, but always hard to address, which is the following. So the idea that I just proposed is something like this, right? You have something like this, and you can have like different modes kind of connecting these. Like you can shift the semantics for what these things mean, right, as you go. So equality in one level is like mode A equalities, common form. And then you shift the mode to B, and that now equality means something like a pact. And then you shift the mode to C, and equality means common work, cooperation, and so on, whatever, right? So what I realize now is that the problem with the meme is that what you're actually doing with the meme usually it looks like this, right? And it's interesting because, as you said, it's a simple form that gets to reproduce and spread without any centralization, right? But what people are actually doing is that they're constantly repurposing the meme to some other use, right? So somebody uses the meme, like just talking about internet, just so as an example, right? Rather than political gesture. Somebody uses the meme to make a comment about a movie, and then they use a meme to troll on somebody. Then they use the meme to actually make a joke with friends. Then they use the meme to something else, but that common form gets spread either way, right? And then you have the idea of a political gesture based on this, which is it's a minimal gesture, but it can kind of, you have situation one and that gesture, then you have situation two, and a political gesture is the same. And again, you can spread the gesture throughout different situations without having to identify them, create a common form, right? What is unclear in this process is that what's allowing it to happen is actually that this thing here is changing from place to place. That's what's allowing this to stick together. Whereas the description is often that it is the meme form that by itself is guaranteeing this. But it's not, the meme form is not on the gesture itself. The meme form is the possibility of like this connection happening every time through a different use in a different logic, which, as we've seen in Vitor's presentation about online activity, it's something that the online world is the house of, right? It flattens the different logics turns the three logics into just a mixture. And then you never know which logic you are applying when you connect with people. Are you creating common spaces? Are you debating conventions? Are you creating common work? So online memes are a good basic metaphor for this thing here. But they are a bad metaphor because you can't track this work. They make it look like this is not where the cost is, right? So that's point one. I think that we can now understand a bit better why this helps to understand that. Like, why are the memes the basis for something like this? Then the second point is that I think that the core idea behind the generic procedure in Badiou, which is a new thing compared with others, is that you don't need this thing in itself to be negative, because negativity appears at the aggregate level. So the very fact that this is contradictory, meaning what organizes this relation does not organize this relation, and does not organize this relation, makes it hard for you to give the overall property that binds it all. So if you, the fact that it is contradictory is where the power comes from. But the contradiction doesn't need to appear at the level of the simple thing you're doing. The contradiction appears at the level of the continuity, right? It's because it continues that it's contradictory. So negation of the world is a aggregate quality of a political process, not a finite property of an encounter or a gesture, right? So that kind of solves what you asked, which is, you don't need to be able to, let's say, put here a grand action that can do this for every process. Because if you were able to come up with this action that brings everyone together, it wouldn't be that contradictory to begin with. So the idea that actions appear at like this regional level, like this group here can be joined under an action. This group here might be joined under a different action. And these two actions here, you can't subsume them under a particular predicate, right? There is no such predicate. Like, that's the usefulness of it. So you want regional convergence. You don't want global convergence in that simple sense, right? And the very fact that you have different logics organizing these things kind of guarantee that that's going to be harder, right? You can go very far with that. So yeah, I just saying that I think that this is an interesting way. And also I think what Victor just said makes a lot of sense, because if you don't have a theory of how you can navigate the different modes, for example, you have an organization here which agrees to have a common form. It's mode A, the way that it connects. The moment that it finds an organization that can only connect with it at mode B, it will have an antagonism, because it's either this or that. There's no way, there's no common space, and you're fucked, right? So I think the idea that you can turn this antagonism into a conflict, because the contradiction will remain, but it's nested inside of a continuous process, right? It becomes possible to think of that, at least. And I think that you can still think a bit further, which is, say that you have this process here of a bunch of organizations connecting through different modes. You can have now a concrete theory of what substitutes money. Because let's say for a finite sequence, it's not for every group, but for a finite sequence that might be like a grand action or like a greater structure that allows you to see this whole thing together. So for example, a general strike where all of these groups can participate, but other groups that come later in this list cannot. Or a forum that binds all these organizations but doesn't bind other organizations. Like, you can have regional mediation. That's pretty much the idea of multiple currencies, right? Which is an idea on the left to substitute money, like to regionalize money and not allow it to be a universal equivalent. It's a regional equivalent, right? So you can take that very far. Like, you can still have the practice of creating regional mediations that cover a bit of that space, right? So I don't know.
Yeah.
I think that this we can take this very far.
And I think it's the fact that many formulations often arrive at having to make this second order idea, like you have a space, you have, you know, a circle, a Soviet, whatever, you find a way to find some sort of like regional consistent. It always arrives at the point like we have to have like a space of spaces, like a circle of circles, a Soviet of like, is this move, which I think is tied to the generic sort of like composition, in which you already have regional conversions. And then, so for example, like tying, you know, like teachers to like delivery riders. Yeah, it's this sort of like second order thing that points to this different kind of problem in which it's not enough to find the single kind of like say like currency that can give guarantee. So I think it yeah, indeed it's
You know,
it
I think
is
if you could like, if you want to be like, make a little poetic quip, it's that in political economy you have the currency, in politics you have the current, right? So something current, meaning something that is happening, that can serve as a regional mediator. But you don't want the current to become currency, because, you know, current can be like a tendency that binds a lot of things. It can be something that is happening that can bind a lot of things. It can be an action that you're going to organize and it can bind a lot of things. But to become the currency, it's to go from regional to universal, right? And then, like, that's not what you want, because then you are going to have to select a logic to be the general logic, and it's going to subsume all the others, generally speaking, right? So we could even use that distinction as a kind of cool little way to distinguish the thing.
So what this is something I missed. I don't know if I just zoned out for a bit, but what is the closure to the currents? What does closure mean when we're talking about this type of current connections?
But you call it the pure present. No, it's just well, it's if you had a space where you have a lot of regional ways of mediating what every popular organization needs to reproduce itself and produce effect. You know, you're talking about you're talking about like a decentralized socialist planning of an economy, right?
Yeah, let me just explain why I was asking this, because at least from a very vague point of view, it reminds me a lot of the regional closures that we have in mode A, you know. So I think what is it? It's
Conciliations.
yeah, global completeness, but local inconsistency, right?
Yeah.
So in what sense would you say, like, would it be different?
For
Just-
example, I think we can give a concrete example. Like, there are regional, let's say you can have a regional mediation of a bunch of organizations through the production of something that spells out what they have in common. That would be more mode A. Sorry, my dog is gone. That would be more mode A. You come up with an object that locally conciliates differences amongst a bunch of organizations. It can be like a program, it can be an activity, but it's not, let's say, the main effect you want to produce is not the construction of something new. The main thing you want to produce is making explicit the common that is below each of these different things. That would be more mode A, right? Conciliation is like finding a small thing that makes explicit what is common amongst a bunch of different things, right? it's different from like a mode B common thing, which is, for example, coming up with a set of rules or laws that applies to a bunch of organizations so that they can all know how to behave. That would be, for example, a big front, leftist front, managing to push the state to pass laws that interest all those groups. That's a regional mediation of mode B. And on mode C, you can, for example, cooperate to construct a specific new thing, and the process of constructing that new thing is what is common, the common process, right? Those will be different mediations. Like, I don't think that regional mediation in itself means mode A. Like
No, yeah, I don't think I don't think it means mode A. I think that I don't know. It seems to there's a similarity that keeps.
yeah, think of this, like if we are right in our theory, a conciliation in mode A is like a new set of myths that explain for everyone how they came to be different. So it's a concrete set of new things, but those new things shine a light on what is the underlying common of the different things, right? So a mode A conciliation or mode A mediation would be, in political terms, like producing something that makes explicit what different groups have in common, right? You wouldn't say it's producing something new in the sense of changing the world in the sense of historical change. You would say it's changing the world in the sense of cosmic change. Like, we now see that we are one, right? That's different from producing an action that changes the correlation of forces. Like, we still think we're different, but we got together in a process, right? So that's mode C versus mode A.
No, okay. I think it.
Something like that. I'm not sure yet, but
Yeah, but I do think that there's this thing that Vito mentioned, which I think is very important. I think this is some discussions we had way back. The process. I mean, I think it really synthesized the process of inquiry decreases internal tension in organization. There's a bet that it may decrease tensions between organizations if they see they have the common problems despite competing ideologies and priorities. I think that the problem of mapping the borders, mapping a border in this sense between organizations in the inquiry, it seems to mix up like mapping in the sense of intelligibility, but also mapping in the sense of binding those points of interaction between organizations, which might take different logical forms. I don't know, just.
for example, just to give an example, because this appeared, this was a question somebody asked in the last meeting of CSO, like, isn't STP exchanging means and ends? Because inquiries are like contacting organizations and they're getting together, but in practice, what you want is to change the world. So isn't that like reducing the core end and focusing on the means? And then one of the things we said is that, yeah, but look at the organizational function of planning ends, right? It is often a way to conciliate conflicts in the present. Like, we don't agree, we don't know each other, we don't like each other, but if we're gonna organize a strike together, we can put our differences aside and focus on creating that end, right? That's kind of mode C, anti-mode C pragmatism. It's based on changing the correlation of forces, producing something new through a constructive process, right? But it mediates. It does lower the conflict. So it's not only mode A that can lower conflicts, lower antagonism in organization. Any mediation that creates something common, it might create something common starting from mode A, starting from mode B, or starting from mode C, right? Any mediation that creates something common, that shines a light on the organizational commonalities between groups, can have that function, right? So I don't think you need to associate lowering antagonism with mode A especially. Like, you could come up with, you could come up with the theory where you can see that investigations and inquiries are raising the organizational aspect, right? Looking to extract what is political and common in all of that, and the effect of that, which can be focused on the critique of mode A, the tension with mode B, or tension with mode C. And it can have the effect, however the connection is made, to shift antagonism towards the world and away from the conflict inside the organization, right? So I think that could be a general description, regardless of mode. It's a good way to evaluate if this connectivity exists or not. I'm not sure if you agree, Victor.
Yeah, I was thinking about it's like the substance of what the inquiry is dealing with. I'm not sure if it's tension or costs or I was just in doubt about how to name what we are trying to like produce when we do these meetings between organizations. That's it.
Couldn't we say that like reducing tension in the sense of creating the sense that there is a common space is a bit more of mode A work? Reducing costs by connecting sounds like something that is intervening at the level of mode C, like reproduction and work, right? They're like reducing, I don't know, obscurity, right? Or reducing the sense of harm, right, that organizations produce with each other is like at the level of mode B, right? It might be different things depending on where the connection established. Like groups remain in conflict. They hate each other. They don't like each other, but there is a common action they can do that lowers the cost for both of them. That would be more mode C, but they didn't really create a mode A relation, right? So it can change perhaps.
This is interesting because you could even explain why some strategic procedures can work in some spaces and not in others. Because if you have like a social formation that for disalignment, due to disalignment, some strategies are more at hand. You can deal with certain issues like through conflict, through dealing with the tensions through mode A, I think this is interesting because it does seem to put a bit of a light into this difference between, I was thinking something along those lines, how mode B seems to be a reduction of antagonism through clarity, through being able to distinguish certain processes, which isn't a do-all solution. You can't transform this into a currency, or you've become like a management consultancy firm, and it's an end in itself. At the same time, it also seems that but I think that you can do cost, like what is the cost in each mode?
Yeah, for example.
I mean, if you don't have clarity, that's a cost for.
Yeah, it seems to me like you have like mode A costs and reproduction is more related to some sort of like effective, how do you say, like circuito dos afetos, like Safatli's book, like how you have an economy of effect, and mode C is more this economy of value proper, and mode B maybe it's more related to like the sort of overall friction to like, like how bureaucracies are made to like, and roads to simplify flow. So it's like It's more this sort of like frictive cost, which is, yeah, I wouldn't know how to call it, but
Yeah, it seems like you're separating the different lanes in a political process through mode B.
Yeah, I mean, I think one way to do it would be to say, because for example, mode A sometimes increases economic cost, like, like Bataille studying the notion of expenditure. Like sometimes you want to burn shit. You don't want to use shit. You want to spend it for no reason. You want to waste time. It doesn't matter. But wasting time is actually optimizing what really matters, which is affinity, commonality of a different sort in mode A. So it might look like you're not optimizing costs from an economic or value point of view because you're wasting resources, wasting time, but you're actually, being economic in another sense, right? You're lowering the risk, you're creating trust, you're doing other things, right? Like us spending money on pizza and cakes. That's what we're doing. If we wanted to be like petty about it, we don't need to do it, right? Exactly, reducing tensions, perhaps, things like that, right? Like people know where others stand, and it creates a bigger sense of personhood amongst people. Everyone becomes a person to everyone else, right? In mode B, I think one way of thinking about it is increasing legibility, right? The state is okay with being very bureaucratic and spending a lot of money, but it wants to make sure that it knows where the borders are, where everyone is, right? The cuts are clear between who's where and who's doing right and who's doing wrong. So you can spend a lot of resources, but you're optimizing that level, which is important, of making sure you know where everyone stands, right? And making sure pacts are being followed through, things like that. And in mode C, you might, put trust into question. You might raise the risk, make people more anxious. You might not do exactly what was written on the paper, but you are optimizing. You're looking to kind of produce something which has use, or that kind of exploits resources in a new way, right? Something like
Yeah,
that.
it seems like, in a sense, like I'm going to like exemplify with something that I think it was part of the case study that I that we put in the atlas, because I think in a sense that was a situation where these issues seemed to appear. There was this preoccupation with tension and trust. I think it's a good pairing. There was this lack of legibility. I think this was something that seemed to be there was this lack of mediation of certain issues through legibility. This is something that was deemed a failure, and there was an attempt to deal with other types of problems through the idea of a basic income inside the collective. And I mean, at least how we spoke of it at the time, it was meant to, it had to do, I think, with use in the sense of time, time for, but I don't know if time is a too loaded concept or whatever, but I think that there's something with the cost issue, which actually has to do with the work. I don't think it can be it can be separated. Yeah, and I agree. I think conflict and coordination seems to be like all around words for.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that it's hard to find the right word simply because it's about a logic. So it might appear like most words have a different meaning in each logic, right? So coordination means something different in mode A, B, and C. Conflict means something different in A, B, and C. So it's more the logic that we're after than the concept, right? Though there are some words that do seem to capture that, I think that we are getting to some sense of, and I would even say that there are potentially always two levels to this, right? Organizations can connect through the production of something or through their reproduction. That's not necessarily the same thing. So like, it's not like groups who are on mode A only reproduce themselves by furthering their common space, right? Hey, Yuna, thank you so much for joining. I know it's very late. Thank you so much.
Thank
We'll-
you. Thank you
Great
so
to have
much.
you next week too.
All right, see you. Thanks. Bye bye.
Yeah, I mean, Karatani used to say, right, that he wants to think of every mode as an economy in some sense. So in a certain sense, every mode would have a productive and a reproductive dimension and a level of exchange, right? But what those things mean changes depending on the logic. And then there is even the further problem, which is we want to submit all of those things to a political logic, which is neither of those. So I'm not sure we need to find like a clear word for each thing, but I do think that like clearly postponing, for example, constructing something new in order to make sure that people feel on board. That's like mode A, like being not economic at the level of mode C, but being more economic at the level of mode A, right? You're reproducing or producing more trust, even though you're not advancing or expanding or constructing something new out of old resources, right? I mean, this is something we haven't discussed yet, but I do think that more and more, the best metaphors for me to discuss mode C have to do, like, in terms of structure, they have to do with constructivism and proof and, you know, almost like computation, like having resources and binding those resources into a new thing, you know. That sounds to me like something that's specific about mode C, because it's very much intuitionistic logic's kind of basic motto, right? You have limited resources to produce something, and that something cannot be trivial with regards to the thing you composed. It's different from mode B, where you're producing, like, the best inferences look like they were already in the beginning, right? Like you're just spelling out the implicit. It's different from mode C in a certain way. But I do think that there is an interesting, just being general here, so we also don't lose too much time. Like I do think that what Victor said and all that we're developing, it looks like investigations are very much kind of plastic ways of trying to make these connections by investigating, you know, by betting that there is a common dimension that is not necessarily at the level of representation. So you need to go further down. It can happen with talking and like meeting, but it can also happen with action. And it can also happen in other ways, right? The general theory includes all those types of connections. And it's part of it knowing enough about the organizations to be able to find that meeting point, right? So I think it also goes back to what Victor said about, you can see that there is a triangulation, right? Militants, we need militants to become or to also have organizers in their groups, so that from inside organizations, we can find out what they are about, how they are constituted. And then communists are the ones who are interested in finding ports between organizations that are creative and that, given how organizations are structured, find out where those commonalities might appear, you know, kind of tension, like creating tension at the level of mode A, B, or C, and so on, right? Bye, Renzo.
Bye-bye.
I mean, I'm not sure if anyone has anything else to add. We want to have a separate meeting on the theory of inquiry anyway. But we can also call it a day if everyone is.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack. Renzo, from this meeting. Would be good if we could schedule like a return on some of the latter discussions.
Yeah, we already have a plan to have I think the militant inquiry meeting is on the 18th of March. So not this week, not next week, the one after. I mean, if Fernanda, she's gonna invite Stefano Harney to join. The guy who writes together with Fred Moulton. If he doesn't come, if he doesn't confirm, we could just do it next week.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
But Victor needs to leave now. I think perhaps we
Yeah,
could.
I'm a bit tired also. But it was a great meeting, everyone.
Yeah, guys, thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Um,